when a tiny lynx cub, barely standing on its legs from the cold, appeared at the window of a solitary house. No one could have guessed that its fate would intertwine with a human's life. It seemed that man and lynx belonged to entirely different realms, yet that encounter bound them forever with an unseen thread. Then something so astonishing happened that it left even the seasoned Thomas in awe. Read to the end to uncover how this remarkable story unfolded. One frigid winter morning in the state of Wyoming, during the harshest cold snap in American history, Thomas Bennett jolted awake and glanced at the thermometer outside the window, -50 degrees. The air was so icy that every blade of grass and leaf was coated in a layer of frost, as if frozen in an eternal moment. Thomas, a lifelong Wyoming resident, was no stranger to cold, but even he flinched at this unprecedented chill. He poured himself a mug of hot coffee and turned on the TV to check the weather forecast, but the howling wind outside pulled his attention away. Approaching the large window, he saw that the wind was so fierce it lifted entire sheets of snow, swirling them into white pillars that danced and twisted like phantoms in a stormy ballet. But that wasn't all. Just as the morning already felt otherworldly, Thomas dropped his mug. The hot coffee splashed across the floor unnoticed. Through the frosted glass, he caught sight of a scene he'd never anticipated. So improbable it felt like a dream. A reddish lynx crouched by the window, its golden-brown fur dusted with frost, its sleek frame trembling from the brutal cold. And imagine this, it wasn't alone. Behind it, huddled in a tiny heap, shivered 3 little lynx cubs, their fur sprinkled with snow, nearly blending into the boundless whiteness around them. Their small bodies shook violently, their faint, pitiful cries almost lost in the wind's roar. Suddenly, the weakest cub collapsed, its fragile form twitching faintly, as if teetering on the edge of succumbing to the merciless elements. But the story takes an even more incredible turn. The mother lynx, as if sensing time slipping away, grabbed the weakest cub by the scruff of its neck and brought it closer to the window. Her movements were steady yet gentle, each step radiating a mother's resolve. She pressed the little one against the glass, her breath fogging the pain, then looked up at Thomas. Her eyes held a mix of despair and hope, a silent plea for help. The wind howled louder, slamming snowflakes against the window with sharp snaps, heightening the moment's tension. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd never witnessed anything like this. The lynx raised a paw and tapped rhythmically on the glass, its claws clicking softly, as if trying to send a message, begging him to understand. Thomas hesitated. Letting wild animals into his home was the last thing he'd ever imagined, but seeing the collapsed cub he knew, if he didn't act, it wouldn't survive the next few minutes. With shaky steps, he approached the door, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty, and cracked it open slightly. And guess what? The lynx immediately brought the frail cub to the threshold, setting it down gently and stepping back, as if to show it meant no harm. Its eyes, brimming with hope and desperation, stayed locked on Thomas. He couldn't turn it away. He scooped up the tiny cub, its body barely warmer than the ice outside, and carried it inside. The mother lynx watched intently, then shifted her gaze to the 2 remaining cubs still huddled in the snow. Her pleading look spoke louder than words. He swung the door wide, motioning for her to bring the others. She didn't waste a second. One by one, she nudged the cubs toward him, moving with care and purpose. When all 3 were inside, Thomas hesitated again. The lynx stood at the threshold, snow swirling around it, awaiting his permission. At last, he nodded and stepped aside. She entered gracefully but warily, shaking the ice from her fur before fully stepping into the warmth of the house. And here's the most astonishing part. She didn't act like a wild animal at all. It was as if she understood she was a guest. She stayed close to her cubs, brushing lightly against the furniture as if testing her surroundings. Thomas quickly gathered blankets, piling them near the fireplace to make a cozy nest for the lynx family. The mother promptly guided her cubs to the warmth, carefully adjusting the blankets with her paws and snout to ensure their comfort. But that's not all. She turned to Thomas, her amber eyes glowing with a gratitude so human-like it pierced straight to his soul. He felt a warmth in his chest, a bond he could neither explain nor deny. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a pack of wolves on the hunt, but inside the atmosphere softened, the house became a sanctuary from the chaos. The cubs, once trembling with weakness, began to stir. The smallest, nestled closest to the fire, let out a faint, mournful whimper, its first sound since arriving. That soft noise filled the room with hope. Thomas watched, breathless, as the mother lynx leaned down and licked each cub, her rough tongue methodically warming them, coaxing life back into their tiny frames. And remarkably, despite their wild nature, the cubs remained surprisingly calm. They pressed against their mother, their curious eyes occasionally darting to Thomas, but with no hint of fear, as if they trusted him completely. Time seemed to stretch. The firelight flickered across their fur, casting a warm golden glow that stood in stark contrast to the icy desolation outside. Every move the lynx made was deliberate and tender, her instincts finely tuned to protect and nurture her young. The weakest cub, now steadier, let out another sound, this one more confident, curling closer to its siblings. Thomas couldn't look away, feeling as though he were witnessing something primal and profoundly sacred. The storm continued its relentless assault, but inside, a silent truce and connection took root. The lynx glanced at him again, her gaze lingering, as if wanting to convey gratitude without words. Thomas, still clutching the long-forgotten empty mug, felt a lump rise in his throat. How could a creature so wild, so inherently fierce, show such gentleness and understanding? The thought humbled him, making him realize just how extraordinary this encounter truly was. Hours passed, and Thomas couldn't tear himself from the scene. The lynx, ever vigilant, kept one eye on her cubs and the other on him. Her demeanor spoke of trust but also unwavering protection. Even more astonishing, at one point, she stood and walked slowly to the kitchen. Pausing at the counter's edge, she looked back at him, ears perked as if seeking permission. Thomas, catching her silent request, grabbed a plate, placed a piece of cooked chicken on it, and set it on the floor. She approached cautiously, sniffed the food, then carried it back to her cubs, dividing it among them with the same deliberate care that defined her every action. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, snow piling high against the windows, the wind howling on like a tireless beast clawing at the house. But inside, the fireplace's warmth and the strange bond forming between man and animal crafted a surreal atmosphere. The flickering firelight seemed to weave a spell over the room, softening reality's edges. Thomas realized that by aiding the lynx family, he'd taken on a responsibility far greater than he'd anticipated. The fragility of life in the wild hit him hard. He couldn't just release them back into the storm. They needed time to recover, and he was their only hope. Over the next few hours, the lynx's behavior continued to amaze him. She took care not to damage anything in the house, even nudging a fallen blanket back onto the pile with her paw. The cubs, growing stronger, began exploring their surroundings, yet they didn't behave like typical wild animals. They seemed to grasp boundaries, staying near the fireplace, refraining from climbing or scratching furniture. Their small paws patted softly on the wooden floor, their movements cautious but curious, as if they too sensed the sanctity of this temporary haven. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. The lynx's intelligence and awareness were unlike anything he'd ever seen. She even communicated with him through body language, tilting her head or flicking her tail to express her needs. At one point, she glanced at the weakest cub, lagging behind its siblings, and with a soft growl, gently nudged it toward the warmth of the blankets, her maternal instinct shining in every gesture. When the storm finally began to weaken, the lynx rose and stretched, signaling it was time for her family to leave. She nuzzled each cub, urging them to follow her to the door. Thomas opened it slowly, the cold air rushing in and making him shiver. The cubs hesitated at first, their tiny paws sinking into the snow, their soft cries fading into the still fierce wind. The lynx patiently prodded them forward, her encouragement steadfast. And here's what stunned him. Before departing, she turned back to Thomas and placed a paw on his arm. It was a brief but powerful touch, a moment of connection. Her grateful eyes conveyed a thank you that no words could match. The lynx family vanished into the snowy forest, their shapes blending seamlessly into the white expanse. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching until they were out of sight. The silence that followed felt heavy but not empty. The warmth they'd brought into his home lingered long after they'd gone, leaving him with a newfound appreciation for the incredible intelligence and emotions of the wild animals he'd always admired from afar. This encounter etched itself into his heart, a story he'd carry for the rest of his life, a tale not just of survival, but of an extraordinary bond forged in the heart of a brutal winter.